Hi, I'm Lee Child, author of the Jack Reacher books, but I'm here today to talk to my good friend Stig Abell, whose new book, Death in a Lonely Place, is out right now. It's his second book. It's a great book. I loved it. There's a lot to talk about. So first of all, let's say hi. Hey Stig, how you doing?
Very good, thanks, Lee. I think of all the authors in the world, you don't even need to qualify when you say, I'm Lee Child, author of the Jack Reacher books. Is there anyone in the world who doesn't know precisely what you've written, I wonder?
Well, I mean, that was the aim all these years, and hopefully it'll get there one day. But I must admit, I was in the elevator yesterday, and somebody said, "Are you the famous author?" And he told me some long, convoluted story about an old lady who liked Reacher, and I thought, yeah, that's the sort of elevator ride I like. And
Yeah,
it,
that's a sign of making it.
yeah. So your new book is, first of all, let's just talk in general terms about it because we don't want to get too insider baseball too quickly. But there's actually a lot that I want to talk about that is fairly technique and technical, and the thought that lies below. I'd like to get into. But first of all, this is a crime novel that is just wonderful, really, really good. But the first thing
Oh,
I want
bless
to
you.
ask is, how do you feel about it?
It's
Because that's a
tricky.
tough one, isn't it?
It is a tricky one because also, like you, I remember you telling me last time we spoke, Lee, that you start writing one, then you write another, and you keep going. And so you often come back to reread your own stuff when it's published, and you almost come to it afresh. So I've actually been rereading Death in a Lonely Place this week to just remind myself what's in it. And there's bits I really like. There's bits that you're not quite sure of. You start having other people read it and they say bits that they like. And I don't know. Are you ever 1,000% confident when it comes to you, Leach? Do you ever feel, you never feel perfect, do you? You think, I like it. I loved writing it. I like the place. I like the characters. I like the story. But it's hard to always feel completely confident in anything. Or is that true for you? I don't know. I mean, what are you, 29 in?
Yeah, I mean, it is totally true. And I think it is also essential, to be honest, that you don't feel that it's any good. I remember, I was three, four books in, and I very hesitantly admitted to another writer that I think it's not working. I think it's awful. I think that it is just this year is not going to happen. And he said, everybody feels that way. And if you don't, then your book is no good. If you get confident and complacent, that is the sign of the book is going to be bad. And
I
that,
always actually, sorry, I was going to say that I always think that doubt, if you had to try and work out what the great driving force in human history is doubt. Doubt, like you can never trust anyone who believes anything 100% because they're psychopaths. And actually, the thing that has prompted most human creativity and trying things out in the end is doubt over certainty, isn't it? I reckon that must be a thing.
yeah, who was it? Bob Dylan or somebody said, I know so much less than I knew when I was young.
Yeah.
Um, the doubt thing is really important. And I think the other thing that technically, until today, no normal person will have read this book. That you wrote it, probably your wife read it
Yeah.
but she's very close partner and very self-interested to an extent. She wants
Yeah.
to make sure it works. Then you've had agents read it, you've had editors, publicists, all those lovely people within publishing. And no doubt they've said nice things about it, but you never know for sure until a normal person who is
Yeah.
not your mother reads it. So today's the day. And I often think the author is the last person to comment on a book, really. It's the reader's opinion that is valuable.
That must be right. And I remember with Death Under a Little Sky, the first one, I got the other thing you get these days, much more than you would have done, presumably even when you started, actually, Lee. It's a lot easier for people to get in touch with you to say what they think now than it would have been 20 years ago or 25 years ago. I'd have thought. And I remember so I've had quite a lot about Death Under a Little Sky which has been largely lovely. But the best one I got was some chap, and he sent me a message on Instagram, and he said, I don't read books, and I've got given this one, and I've not read books in 30 years. And I started reading this one, and it's got me into books, and it's made me into, I like crime fiction now, but I hadn't read a book until probably I hadn't read a book in my adult life. And then I got given this one. And funnily enough, no, with you, my mother-in-law, Lee, I may have told you this before, I'm not sure I did. She'd stopped reading. And I remember this about 6 or 7 years ago, and I said, "Well, why have you stopped reading?" And she just her life had changed, and she'd not done it. And I gave her the first Reacher book, because I've got all the Reachers somewhere. I mean, I bet if you look at my bookshelves, there'll always be. I've not checked actually. There'll be. There you go. Die Trying's up there. There's always one. There's always one in shot with any one of my bookshelves. And I gave her that one, and she started reading. And then that's the thing she does. She doesn't sleep very well now, and she reads loads of books. And so when you have a reader who just says, I just got it, I grabbed it, and it talked to me, and I felt something. That's the thing you're going for, isn't it? Really.
It totally is, and especially with the non-habitual readers, because you're going to get a lot of readers who read all crime fiction and they explore it constantly, and they're going to like it, I'm sure. But the ones that really count are the people that read one book a year, or maximum two. You see them. I've seen them at the airport. They're leaving for holiday, and it's a weird thing. It's almost a distressed purchase. You see them standing there, oh, I better buy a book. And so they buy that book, and if they like it, that's great. What worries me is if they don't like it, they'll maybe never read again. I mean, that could be what happened for these people that go 30 years without reading a book. They just got fed up with it.
Something will have blocked them, wouldn't they, along the line? Because it's also one of the things, I always say this, but one of my greatest pleasures in life is finding a series of books. It's just finding a character. Reacher is this to absolute perfection, where you just find a world and a character and a confidence in the author. When you, and this is only my second one. I've written the next two, actually, so I'm up to 4 that are actually done. But this is only the second one. But what you kind of want as your writer, and I certainly find as a reader, is you want that confidence where you think, I love the character, I love the world, but I actually trust the author that he's not going to screw this up for me, that I'm not going to, and we'll come to it, I'm sure, if we talk about our favorite authors and people who mean something to us. They've earned that trust because over 20 books or 5 or 10 or 15, they've never let you down. And that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, that is absolutely crucial. For me, I call it the 3-second airport test. If you are changing planes and you've run out of something to read, you've got 3 seconds to grab something. There are authors that will not let you down, and you're safe just grabbing their latest, and you don't even have to look at it. They're not going to let you down. But that's a very neat segue into, it is your second book, and I guess it depends very much on the circumstances, how you wrote your first book. But most people spend an infinite or unlimited amount of time on their first book because it's not yet contracted. There's no date on it. Typically, people take years for their first book. And then they've got to do their second book pretty fast. And they've got to do it against the glow of acceptance of their first book. And I think that piles on a lot of stress. And so you get this so-called difficult second book. How did you write the first one? I mean, was that a protracted thing for years, or was it pretty quick? And did that influence the second one?
I'm so glad you asked it. So the first one I wrote in lockdown, for pleasure. I mean, actually, all of them so far. I wrote the first 1.5 before the first one had been bought. So there's quite a chunk of it was just purely for joy. I wrote this for joy, for the love of the genre, for the love of being creative and that feeling of creating a world. You mentioned my wife reading it. I wrote it 1,500 words a day, every day, for her to read at 7 o'clock in the bath each night. So at 7 o'clock in the bath, I would send her, and she'd read on her phone in the bath the next 1,500 words of the novel. And certainly for the first one, everything was written purely for joy. And like I said, in these chunks. So I know, having spoken to you, one of the you work very much on routine, and I got into a routine. I wrote the same time every day. I wrote more or less the same number of words each day, and I sent it to my wife to read in the bath, and then I kept that going. And with the second one, I was already into it, really. By the time I started, I sold and they bought two. So the publishers bought two in one go, and I'd already started the second one, and so I carried on in the man that I did. But here's the thing that happened. I'm not sure this will have ever happened to you. So I finished the second one again at the similar speed to the first one, really with exactly the same attitude that this is an exercise of love. And I got an email back from the editor saying, "Can we have a meeting?" I thought, oh no. And they said, I sat down and they said, "We really like the first half of Death in a Lonely Place." I can't remember if it was called that. I think it was just called No Taboo at that point, which is the name of the shadowy conspiracy at the heart of it. They said, "We really like the first half and we really like the second half, but we think they're different books. And so we need to do something about that." And so what I did in the end, so in the book, they uncover this conspiracy. Jake Jackson, my guy, covers a conspiracy, and it leads him to an evil newspaper baron in a country house. And in the original version of this, it became like a country house mystery, where there were people, he had to solve a sort of very sort of semi-traditional country house mystery. And they said, "We really like that, but we want actually this to be much more expansive, go back to the feeling of the first half, the countryside, the tactile bits." And so I actually, with the second book, I got halfway through and I pressed Control Alt and highlighted the second half, and I deleted it and started off again and actually sent it in a different direction. So that was the tricky second book bit. But to me, it was also kind of great because I'd had such a fun writing it. I got to write another half again, and that was a real pleasure in the end.
Well, that is great to hear that. I mean, I would hang myself rather than delete half a book, but to do it with joy, and that really comes across. And that is something that, to backtrack a little bit about trusting an author, about the appeal of a series, you've got the same cast of characters in the same place, because it's very much location based, an intriguing location, literally off the beaten path, very off the grid, unwired, or whatever people call it these days. So the familiarity and the comfort is there from the first one. The title is sort of branded so that what fascinates me is it absolutely stands alone as a great book on its own, but it is also an act of love about the genre. It is just the title, Death in a Lonely Place. And I assume that it's going to be death somewhere for all the titles. And
certainly for the next two, I think that, yeah.
Right, think that. Which is, both smart in terms of commercial appeal, because it does brand it, it does identify it, but also it struck me as a sort of act of love. I mean, these are almost golden age titles, and elegiac in a way that crime fiction can be. You're so in touch with the nature of crime fiction. And I'm not sure that I've ever, I mean, obviously I know loads of crime fiction authors who read and love the genre, but nobody has ever brought it quite so front and center that this is not only a crime novel, but it's a celebration of crime fiction in general.
Yeah, and I think that's because my motivation for this, Lee, in the end, at the beginning, was because of that. And so one of the conceits behind it is that Jake becomes a detective because his uncle, who dies and gives him Little Sky, this place off the beaten track, gives him a library of detective books. And the reason he became a policeman was because of detective fiction. The reason I wrote the book is because of detective fiction. And I also think that detective fiction does exist in the world as well as the world of crime. I mean, it is a thing that influences people. And I'm so glad you said elegy, because that sort of elegiac tone, that note of slightly longing for something is really important to me. And so, yeah, he lives in Little Sky, and he names the different parts of where he lives after detective characters. There's including Reacher. Reacher's in it as well, but there's Poirot Point, there's Agatha Wood, there's Reacher Island, which is in the middle of Chandler Lake. And so he is influenced. And this new character that comes in this book, who I absolutely love, and it's going to be the same characters in the next two as well, and hopefully beyond that. And there's a woman called Martha, who is a former spy stroke police woman who gets her legs shot out from under her, and she becomes a crime writer herself. And so she's this sort of expert on conspiracy. So one of the characters now is both a kind of policewoman stroke crime writer, and again gives me another perspective into it a little bit when she talks to Jake, and she becomes someone who helps him eventually unravel this conspiracy.
It's also very smart about the comfort and familiarity is important. You know, that kind of pre-sells the book, that if they've liked last year's, they're going to buy this year's. But you can't do the same thing over and over again. And so there is quite a significant switch, I think, between the first one, Little Sky, and the second one, Lonely Place, in that it's not just a local missing person or some local issue. You've changed it up into a larger issue. So otherwise you get a problem where, 20 books in, that little county is going to be the most dangerous place on earth. A bit like Murder, She Wrote, or the one I love is Morse. It's the most dangerous occupation in the world is to be an Oxford Don. And so
I've just reread the Morse books, Lee. And there's only 13 of them. And what amazed me about them actually was I reread them, and it's amazing. The first couple are very straight. They're almost sober actually, and then by the end, they're very whimsical and playful, and they're just masterful things by the end. But you can actually watch when you reread a series. I don't know if this is true about you. I don't know if you feel this about your books. You can definitely see the arc of a changing approach and a changing kind of confidence. Don't you think that there's just something there where you see the author stroke narrator figure start to shift over a period?
Yeah, and I think that is inevitable because I try my absolute best to not let that happen. I want it to be the same every time. Obviously a different story, different components and so on, but I want it to be, I don't like this sort of English literature degree thing where there's got to be a character arc and the character has to go on a journey and all that kind of stuff. I think what I want as a reader, and everything I do is based on what I want as a reader, is I want to relive that momentary dopamine burst where one of your favorite authors has a new book, and and again, here's a personal thing about the difference between physical books and ebooks. I think deep in our brains somehow we are still hunter-gatherers. And the idea that you can go and actively get this book and you're holding it. I think that is a wonderful feeling, especially with a series that you love and an author that you trust. And so you've got to have a springboard to lead into that, but then it's got to be a little different. And I was fascinated by the no taboos thing, because that is pretty heavy duty. That is nasty, nasty stuff that we've seen similar things in a couple of movie series like Hostel, was it? Or, really nasty people who think they can get away with it. And that would be the one thing that absolutely infuriates Reacher, is that, there's a line in one of the Reacher books where he said, why do you do all this? And he vaguely answers, oh, I would like to look after the little guy. And his companion says, really? You care that much about the little guy? And he's forced to think about it. And he says, no, I don't care about the little guy. I just hate the big guy. Yeah. And that was the feeling I got out of this story. Awful people, but very smart, not to just make it another local killing, make it something much bigger and more grandiose.
It's so interesting you said, because I think that's so right about Reacher. And in some ways, Jake Jackson is a kind of a British cousin by marriage of Reacher, in the sense that he has that sense of of right and wrong. And actually, the tension for Jake Jackson, my guy, is he at one level wants to get away from the world. I mean, the books are really this question of how much is renunciation possible in the modern world? How much can you get away from technology? Which again, Reacher explores all the time, you know, with his lack of phone and his freedom. So he has this vast canvas of the United States where he's never tied to a location. Whereas I'm tying my person to a location that doesn't have any of the technological snagging in it. But so the tension for Jake is, can you walk away from your responsibilities in society or not? And he has a relationship with a woman and a relationship with the world, where the question is, at one level, he just wants to go and run around his beautiful place and experience nature and concentrate on all that. And on another, he doesn't want to turn his back on things he can help. And this question of your responsibility to the world, not letting powerful people screw over people, if you can be the one that fixes it, I think's actually completely crucial to who he is. And at least another thing which I think is really important about Reacher as well, Leah, I don't know how much you agree on this, but you know, you're saying there's that feeling of dopamine when you get a new book. Part of that's because I think the value of niceness, the value of decency in sophisticated crimey stuff, violent stuff, decency is kind of seen as a bit shticky. And actually, to me, decency, niceness is really the thing, one of the major things I want in a book. I want to root for someone. I want to feel that there is a set of values out there. And I know you do this with Reach, because Reach at one level is very violent, and some of the books are more violent than others. And I think with mine, there'll be ups and downs of violence. There'll be body counts will be higher and lower and all of that stuff. But the thing that stops it being ever gratuitous is decency. And I think that's really important in crime fiction.
I think so too. And I'm glad you said that, because I honestly, I remember one time, possibly the third book or something like that. I wrote a character, minor character. Reacher was he was in the Air Force or something, and Reacher was asking some historical question about helicopters in Vietnam. And probably in reality, that guy would have been bored or disinterested or hostile even, or uncooperative. But I just wrote him as helpful. And afterward, I thought, is that realistic? Maybe, but it's what people want. People want to believe that the world has nice people in it who will do the right thing. And I completely agree with that. And that's what I respond to too. He doesn't, Jake, he's like Reacher in place. He's got a lovely place and it suits him well. He doesn't want to be bothered. He doesn't want to be involved, but he has this noblesse oblige that almost Marxist, from he who can to he who needs. And I think that is super valuable and incredibly popular. It's almost a secret ingredient that not everybody understands that the public wants. The other thing that I loved, though, that absolutely made it agonizing, was the contact with these bad people was through the girlfriend.
Yeah.
And so Jake it's an immediate dilemma. I mean, they're obviously dodgy. I just thought, okay, here we go, as soon as they were mentioned. And Jake would, of course, have just stayed away from them completely, but he doesn't want to, he cannot, and obviously doesn't want to control what the girlfriend does in terms of a contract she's getting. But you have this feeling of impending doom. So I thought it was very smart to have her the vulnerable one at first, and watch her gravitate towards what was clearly horrible and dangerous.
Yeah, and then I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I also didn't want to then make sure that she was without agency in fixing the problem as well. And I know you. So to me, the love story between the two of them is interesting with Reach, because Reach actually is a very sentimental figure as well, and he has relationships that amount to love stories, and he has friendships that are long lasting, but he doesn't have a sort of grand passion. Whereas I think Jake and Olivia, to me, are modeled on the Peter Wimsey, Harriet Vane feeling, which is Dorothy Sayers, to my mind, the greatest, possibly greatest crime fiction ever is the second half of Dorothy Sayers, when Whimsy and Vane meet in Strong Poison, and he tries to save her from well, he does save her from being accused of being a murderer. And then it goes on to this passionate relationship where each of them have got to work out how their relationship fits into their world, because it can't just be one person saying, it's my world, you've got to come into it. Only they've both got to say that to one another. And that to me is a really critical part of these books, actually, that crux of a relationship. Because Jake comes to Little Sky because his first marriage fails. They keep having miscarriages, and although they don't fall out in terms of there's no reason why his marriage breaks up because of something happens other than that. They just fall out of love, and they fall out of an ability to be compatible. And therefore I wanted to create the thing he's searching for, is kind of compatibility. How do you fit two lives together?
Yeah, which is, Reacher's perpetual problem, that it's a total catch-22. He does intensely fall for certain women, generally strong and smart. And the problem is, a strong and smart woman is going to enjoy Reacher for 48 hours, but sees zero future. And so it lazily, people say Reacher is a love him and leave him type, and that's absolutely not true.
Completely not true.
It is the woman who wises up and realizes this ain't going to work. So it's actually Reacher that continually gets dumped.
And that's the distinction between your world is the world of transience. Reacher is never still, ultimately. He's always on the move. Whereas what I'm very keen on with Little Sky is the world of permanence. I want to create this place which people can smell and sense, and as the seasons rise and fall and different and the countryside changes, they're locked into the soil there in a way that's kind of the mirror opposite of Reacher, actually. He's always on the road in that great American tradition, and this is British, and it's smaller scale, and it's more locked into one place.
So, I mean, as a professional individual, your life has been about news media, this, that, the other, that is getting to be incredibly fast and clickbaity and somewhat trivial in some ways, an endless barrage of stuff. So Little Sky, how much of that is a personal reaction from you in terms of saying, this is just wearing me out, it's wearing us out, why don't we all just take it easy?
I think that it began very much because of COVID. Everyone was having that conversation because everyone was starting to evaluate the role of technology in their lives. But actually, and everyone said, remember, everyone said, well, after COVID, everything will be different. Pace of life will change. The things we valued during COVID will continue to value. And of course, that turned out to be crap. Actually, COVID was in the rearview mirror, and everything in terms of the speed of life was redoubled. And so I definitely feel, because I've got kids from 5 to 15. I've got 3 kids. The youngest is 5. The eldest is 15. I know yours are older, but I really feel that we're having this giant social experiment. The world is the giant social technological experiment, which we do not know the answer to. There's no control. There's no means of working out the damage of this pace. And I always remember this is in the BBC in 1933, there was the 8 o'clock news on the BBC, and the announcer said, today there was no news, so we're going to play some piano music. And the BBC said there would have been only one radio station then, play piano music for 15 minutes because there was no news. And this is the 1930s when the world was heading towards war, but there was no immediate news. And now actually everything in the world doesn't move on a 24-hour news cycle. It moves on a 24-minute or 2.5-minute news cycle. And I think there is a fantasy aspect of Little Sky for me, which is a reaction against that. And it is a worry. I mean, it is a genuine worry that how can someone said to me about 3 months ago that today is the slowest day of the rest of your life. because tech only works in one direction and it's faster and faster. So in a year's time, it'll be worse than it is now, or faster at least. And that, I think, is a real, it weighs on my mind continually, I think.
Yeah, me too. And do you find it difficult to jump between the professional world and then reading at home? Or because reading, especially the sort of stuff that we both love and that you are honoring in a way uh, with the Jake Jackson books, is kind of patient. There's the luxury of patience that it is going to take you hours or all day, possibly 2 days, to get to the end of the story. And the metaphor of stretching out on the couch and just luxuriating in that slow pace is, I love it, but I find it hard to transition now. This year in the States, we're all panicking like crazy about the politics and the election and so on. And so I tend to spend the morning reading online news and stuff and YouTube clips or whatever. And then it's hard to calm down and stretch out and commit to reading for several hours.
More necessary than ever. I think the flip of that, Lee, is actually becomes more important. I mean, there's a test everyone should try and do, because I try and do this, is you get your phone when you're reading and you turn it upside down, put it next to you, and just time yourself. How long can you read almost without thinking about it? Because it becomes such an instinctive reaction. You just sort of go, just check nothing's happened, nothing's gone on in the world. I know I turn off all notifications on my phone because I figure I get the news quick enough. I mean, I present a 4-hour daily news program on the radio. So I feel I'm already plugged into the news to an unhealthy extent. I think it's a really good test that if you can sit for half an hour, let alone days and whole afternoons, if you can sit for half an hour and leave your phone alone, that's something we should all try and do every single day. And in some ways, I think books, hard copy books, like you say, although there's definitely a place for ebooks, definitely a place for audiobooks, because they have their own slowing down effect, but they become more important than ever. They almost become essential because they're taking you out of something that's really dangerous and is pervasive and insidious. And so I kind of feel the value of it more than ever, actually. But it's harder, like you say, because you've got to try and discipline your brain in another direction.
Yeah, it's changing gear, but you can really tell which are the great books, though, because that thing about timing yourself. I mean, admittedly, I was on vacation. We were at our place in France, and I remember laying out on the back terrace, reading a Stephen King, which was about 8 inches thick, and I remember thinking, "Oh, I'm hungry. I should have lunch." And I looked at my watch, and it was 7 p.m. And
Yes.
the entire day had just gone. Magical feeling, and all too rare, as you say.
Yeah, we've got to find a way of clinging to it, though, Leah, I think is the critical point.
Well, yeah, I mean, story will never go away. Delivery method. I'm interested in audiobooks, huge explosion in audiobooks right now, which I think is entirely logical because if you think back into prehistory, we invented story at some point. We don't know when. We started making things up at some point. Could be 100,000 years ago, could be more, who knows? But almost all of that time has been oral.
Yeah.
We've been listening to stories. And then regular people like you and me, it's really only, 150 years that normal people have read stuff off a page.
Yeah.
And for a long time, audiobooks were cranky because you either had like 45 cassettes or 20 CDs or whatever. And there was something rather stigmatized about it.
Yeah.
My mother's generation, for instance, it was for blind people and so on. And so there was always a slight otherness about audiobooks. But now we've got a generation of people who download things by routine and who wear earbuds constantly. So there's no barrier anymore, and it is exploding. And I think that's perfectly natural, because to be told a story is basically our cultural DNA, I think.
I agree with that completely. For me, I like to control the pace a bit more myself. To me, the power of grabbing a book and having it in a hand and feeling it. And there's that line by Jane Austen where she talks about the telltale felicity of the pages getting fewer and fewer, particularly with crime books, actually, genre books, because you know there's an outcome. And there's that tension when you're reading a crime book, which is, I want to get to the end and I don't want to get to the end. And that push and pull feeling you have is brilliant. That to me is the heart of the pleasure of a crime book. Like, I'm getting, what's happening? And then you realize you're reading too fast, and actually you've skipped a paragraph there because you want to know what happens at the end of this scene. And that kind of push pull pace change that you control, I love. So you're totally right there. The idea of audiobooks being something to sniff at, I think, is what, 10 years out of date now, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the more, people who have got out the habit of reading, read less now. People I suspect do read a bit less now, physical stuff. It means that they're not being kept out of the conversation.
Right. I call it the right thumb. When you're reading a book, your remaining pages are under your right thumb.
Yeah.
And that somehow, the thickness that you're feeling there somehow programs your brain to, the end is coming up, and that influences the pace a little bit. But then I get very cross when you suddenly realize that under your right thumb was a preview of the next book, and
Yeah.
your timing out.
I actually check though. One of the things I do is that with crime books, I particularly, is this actually the end here, or is there the preview of the next one? Are there the acknowledgements? Where are the acknowledgements even in this? Because you want to know precisely where you get to the end. And Reacher books, I think, are really, because the linearity of Reacher, the kind of get me from here to here, is what gives it such its pace. And that feeling of, I want to go along the road with Reacher, but I know the road is, there's an ending, there's a point. And that's why these books, why this, there's no resolution in life, there is no solution in life. And of course, what these books give you is both of those things. They're a package. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's just something there that you can't get in life. Life's messy. And as you say, it's faster, and it's even more messy now than it's ever been because of how hyper-connected we are. So the idea of something that actually resolves itself is more important than ever.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly that's got to be the whole appeal, that life in general sucks, that whatever happens to you, there's going to be no closure. I remember, not just now, but from years ago, your car, I remember my car was broken into and the radio stolen. And there's zero chance of that ever being resolved. Zero. And even now, I think, where we had a place in England in rural Sussex where in 12 years, I never saw a policeman. And the anecdotal stuff from neighbors is they won't even come, if your shit gets broken into or something, they're not interested. So you live with this buzz of frustration all the time. And crime fiction fixes it for you. They will find who stole your radio. They will find who stole your lawnmower. And if it's a Reacher book, they'll get shot in the head. And the immense satisfaction as a contrast, as a consolation to the real world is huge, especially if they are really bad guys, which I think gave this one Death in a Lonely Place. I think that's what gave it such power, because they're loathsome, these people. And of course, we've got to ask, with you being so connected in the media, is it a composite, or is it a sort of sly portrait of an individual?
That's a really different, so one of the baddies is a newspaper baron. And I've got to be careful, I think, for legal reasons. But there is one newspaper baron for whom I've never worked. So I've not had any professional connection, except for I've met him once at an event, and I was there, and someone introduced him to me, this guy, and he was such a bumptiously loud, obnoxious, self-confident individual for no basis whatsoever. Anyway, he turned to me, and I'd never met him before. And it was one of those things where you just get introduced to people and they're clearly looking around for powerful people to talk to, of which I wasn't one. And it was only going to be like, hello. Anyway, turned around, looked at me and went, are you queer? I was like, excuse me, are you queer? I was like, you got a beard. Only queers have beards. And he walked off. And little man, obviously. And it just slightly stuck in my mind. And as you know from working in the media, there's all sorts of stories about big characters, particularly from the past, who have said and done obnoxious things. And so there's a little germ, I think, of that guy in Martinson, who's one of my baddies.
Yeah, I mean, I never admit either who they're based on because, you know, you don't want to get in trouble. Although, generally speaking, they don't do anything about it. I've heard it referred to as the small dick defense. Who's going to admit it in public? You know, who's going to get up in court and say, you know, that awful, horrible, backstabbing weasel on page 100? That's me. You know, they just don't. So it's not all that risky, but you've got to have not necessarily the germ of the person, but the germ of your own reaction to the person.
Yeah, the tone. It's a tonal thing, isn't it? It's a kind of, there's just this feeling of someone who doesn't care about propriety because of the world they live in, because not enough people say no to them, not enough people. And, you know, I don't believe in giant conspiracies, Leah. I've seen the world of politics very close up. I've seen the world of media very close up. And as you'll know, it's just full of incompetent people. It's full of people screwing things up left, right, and center. The notion of giant, intricate conspiracies, I just don't think they're not good enough at it to work. But do I think that powerful people find ways not to behave in the way that ordinary people do? Absolutely. And there's this sort of that low-key conspiracy of a kind of conspiracy to protect the people who really have the power. That exists, and this book's a kind of little bit about that. I don't think that you know everyone gathers together to rule the world and keep us from it. I just don't think anyone's competent enough to do that. But there is a conspiracy of power that does exist to a certain extent.
I agree. Because you get people that give you two messages. One is that government is useless, hopeless, and incompetent. And oh, by the way, they've maintained a conspiracy through 8 consecutive administrations, and nobody said a word about it. And so, yeah, it's an incoherent point of view. But there is not necessarily a conspiracy, but an assumption that certain people can get away with anything. And, you know, sadly, it's true. And therefore, it is super satisfying when one of those people, you know, we won't give away any spoilers, but believe me, the end of Death in a Lonely Place is extremely satisfying.
Well, bless you. I had such fun writing it, Lee. Now, before you go, a couple of people asked me to ask you a couple of questions. So we got a couple of Q&As. You ready for this?
Okay.
It's about books we love. So we'll just do a couple of minutes. I know we've been talking for ages, but I've had such fun doing it, Lee. Are you ready?
Yeah.
You're wrongly accused of murder, Lee. Which fictional detective do you want taking your case?
Well, it would have to be a private detective because police detectives are heavily invested in convicting you, whether or not you did it. So I think I would probably, it depends. If it was in the US, I would go for Philip Marlowe.
Okay.
Because he and I would get along pretty well.
Yeah.
If it was in the UK, I'll try Jake Jackson. Why not? I mean,
he'd give it a go. I always think Sherlock Holmes. When I was just rereading Sherlock Holmes, which I do I don't know if you do that, Lee, anymore, but I still always, if I'm ever waiting for 10 minutes for something, I just find a Sherlock collection. I think if you genuinely didn't do it, he would find out that you didn't do it and would produce the evidence to get you off.
Well, you would. That's true. And isn't it interesting? Reading Sherlock Holmes is so different than our memories of the film and TV adaptations over the years. He's almost a different character. He's violent in himself. He's a skilled street fighter. He is
Yeah.
fairly uncompromising in lots of ways.
But then there's the moments, the reason why I love it so much goes back to the thing about niceness. There are a couple of moments in the stories where he and Watson, this is my favorite bit, I think, in the whole canon of that is after he comes back from the dead and Watson thinks he's dead. And Watson is walking down the streets of London and this old bookseller approaches him and they bump into each other and he takes Watson back to a room and he points Watson to look the other way. And then when Watson turns back, the bookseller, this old wrinkled bookseller, is back to being Sherlock. And Watson faints. And Sherlock comes up to him and sort of cradles him in his arms and says, "Oh God, I didn't realize you cared this much and there's this moment, I think that he would say something like, there's this genuine love passes between them just for these buttoned up Victorian men." I think that's lovely. That's one of my favorite bits in all of detective fiction, I think.
It really is an interesting echoes down the years. I mean, we were talking about Morse. You could say Morse was a little basically similar to that with his various sidekicks.
Yeah, and there's a bit in Morse, which I've just reread, where he actually sends Lewis a postcard and tells Lewis that his name is Endeavour. And this woman says to him, "Well, you must tell Lewis your name now," and he does, and it's a very Watsonian thing for that. Lee, do you have detective? Well, I'll finish here because otherwise we'll go on forever. Give me 3 detectives, private or otherwise, at a dinner party that you would attend. Fictional figures that you would just be interested in. We'll have Reacher, but I'm not sure how much Reacher would enjoy it. But I think Reacher would be an interesting figure to be at a dinner party with. He wouldn't. I don't think he'd have fun, would he?
I think he might, depending on who the others were, because he's very curious. He wants to examine other people's trade secrets, which I'm like. I love to do that. If I go to a dinner party, I don't want to talk about what I do at all. I don't want to say a word about it. I'm much more interested in hearing what somebody else does and what are the tricks of the trade, what are the dodges, what key things does the public not understand. I love that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm with you on Peter Wimsey. Although I would stretch it. I would like to have Harriet there as well.
That's right.
Yeah, that is a tremendous couple. I mean, beautifully written from her point of view. I wrote an intro to an anniversary edition of Have His Carcass.
I've got it. I've got it over there. I can see it now with your introduction in it.
And a fascinating dynamic between Sayers' personal life and the investment she made in Wimsey. And it's really interesting you said that the later ones are better than the earlier ones, because the earlier ones were very much conceived as earners. She was a smart woman, well-educated, but had the usual disadvantages in getting employment that women did in the 20s and 30s. And so Wimsey was supposed to be an earner at the beginning. But then also with the post-World War I thing, shortage of marriage partners possibly, and the ones that were still around could be somewhat damaged. She fell in with one that was damaged, and he then revealed himself as just not functioning well at all. And she threw herself into Peter Wimsey in a way that just multiplied the appeal of the rest of the series, I think.
And she got grief for it, didn't she? Because everyone said in that slightly patronizing way, "Oh, you've fallen in love with your character," which they'd never say about a male author. And yet male authors fall in love with their characters as well. And they often...
Oh, yeah, I would say it about male authors. Thomas Harris, I think. The gap after Silence of the Lambs until the next one, whatever it was called, it was about 9 years. And disastrous. He just totally fell in love with Hannibal Lecter in a way that made the subsequent books no good at all.
Yes, silly. They became, and the films became
Yeah.
even silly about it. No, I think that's exactly right with it. Can I throw in then for one other? I think my favorite private detective of sorts is Travis McGee, the John D. MacDonald books, which people, you and I love, although the sexual politics, particularly in the early ones, because they were written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the 60s ones are a little bit shady because of when they were written. But the sentiment in them of this guy who is taking his retirement in chunks, again, an expert, seen life, makes a good gin and tonic, I think would get on with people, is a shambling Floridian environmentalist.
Yeah,
I think he's almost one of my favorite characters in fiction, I think.
me too. And 64, I think, was the first in the series. And yeah, the sexual politics are horrific in that sense. The gender relationships are bad. But the environmentalism was incredibly ahead of its time. 1964, that was before Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which is usually taken to be the first environmental book. Well, MacDonald was talking about it well before that. Yeah, you're right. And again, a great sidekick, Meyer, who
The Economist.
yes, the academic economist. And you can totally picture the two of them together. And the series as a whole, 21 books. And there's really only one of them where anything happens on page one. The one that's called Darker Than Amber. He and Mayer are fishing at night in a canal, and they're just about to call it a night when somebody throws a body off a bridge and it lands in their boat. But that is the only one where anything happens. It's normally nothing much on page one and page two, but you cannot put it down. And that, I've studied it for years. Why can't you put it down? That guy had, of course, he was the pulp generation where they were generating stuff constantly. 21 Travis McGee's, but he wrote probably hundreds of other novels.
Yeah.
And so they had some kind of insight and technique that we can all learn from. But yeah, Travis McGee would be another good one.
It's also a sign, actually, Lee, and maybe this is a good place to leave it, is that, again, fundamental niceness, friendships that exist on the page, all of that sort of sentimental attachment, a series with a thread running through it, a series where you know what you're going to get just by buying the book. You just grab it. Those are all connected by colors in the titles, but there's something there. And it gives you reassurance, and it gives you joy, and it gives you pleasure. And that's why, in the end, we're into all of this stuff, isn't it? That's what it boils right down to.
And so to sum all of that up, read the new one by Stig Abell, Death in a Lonely Place, which is a redolent title. It's a wonderful book. And I'm so happy to hear there's more to come. Already written. This is what I like. Productivity. Well done, Stig.
Well, listen, and what a joy it is speaking to you. Thank you so much for doing this. I've had a ball.
Real pleasure.